Today, when we look at the countries of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland, we see four separate countries that are similar in some aspects, but also very clearly independent of each other. However, at one point in the 19th century, there was serious talk in the Nordic countries about creating a union, otherwise known as Scandinavia, and I asked myself, what would a unified Scandinavia look like, and how would it have changed the course of the 19th and 20th centuries? Before I get deep into the scenario itself, I need to establish some context. Since the beginning of early modern history in Europe, there has always been some form of power struggle in Scandinavia between Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, or with some outside force. The Great Northern War in the early 1700s destroyed Sweden, when Russia decided it was hungry for Estonia, ruining Sweden's chance at becoming a major European player. Denmark was repeatedly harassed and attacked by the British in the early 1800s, and after gaining Schleswig-Holstein in the Great Northern War, lost it in 1849 with the Prussian invasion, and Norway was, well, there. There was also fighting between the countries, with such events as Denmark fighting Sweden alongside Russia in the 1700s, and Norway rebelling, and losing, against Sweden when Denmark gave the Norwegian Union up to the Swedes in the 1810s. Despite all these differences and squabbles, the people of Scandinavia saw pan-nationalist sentiments taking root in places like Italy and Germany, paving the way for fractured kingdoms becoming one, unified nation-state. And this idea began to spread north to Denmark and Sweden. In the 1840s, university students of both Denmark and Sweden initiated a movement to unite the Nordic nations into one union, one country. However, initially both kingdoms were wary of this, seeing themselves as their own independent countries, and not being too favoring of their counterparts either. Despite not being supported too greatly by the crowns, the people began to romanticize the idea of a unified Scandinavia, with poets writing songs and anthems, talking about the glory of the three brothers, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Then, in 1844, Oscar I became the king of Sweden and Norway, after which relations with Denmark began to warm up, and the idea of a unifying state seemed within reach. However, after the loss of Schleswig-Holstein to the Germans by Denmark, and Sweden refusing to join an alliance against the growing Prussian nation, the idea of pan-Scandinavianism began to die out, eventually becoming nothing more than a distant memory. What if, in an alternate world, the three nations do form into one nation? What if, rather than dispel the idea of unifying, the Swedish and Danish crowns come together to form Scandinavia? How would this have changed the politics of Europe? Well, here's one possibility. In our timeline, when Denmark had to defend itself against Germany, Sweden sent a group of its soldiers to aid. However, they didn't actually see any combat. In this alternate timeline, though, they do go to the front lines and fight by their Nordic brothers. In the end, they would still lose to Germany. But what they would gain is a sense of unity, that we're in this together. After months, if not years, of political back and forth between an assembly of Denmark and Sweden, with Norway just sort of watching, the two kings decide to form one nation, putting the capital of the newly created Scandinavian Empire in Stockholm, since Sweden was arguably more influential at the point, though those specifics aren't hugely important. There would be one parliament created to represent all of Scandinavia, and a diarchy of King Oscar I of Sweden and King Christian VIII of Denmark. Would a diarchy have worked and held together? It's hard to say, but I could see it working if the two rulers were able to set aside their differences, and go forward with the intent to rule Scandinavia as one nation, and not just a union of separate nations. Difficult, but not impossible. One of the first effects that we would see in a unified Scandinavia would be uncertainty of what to do on the part of other European powers. Due to the nature of European politics, each of the Scandinavian powers had been at odds, at one point, with Russia, Germany, and the United Kingdom. The Prussian state to the south of Scandinavia posed a threat to the stability of this new Nordic Union, but so did the behemoth that was the Russian Empire. Sweden and Denmark had both lost land to Russia and Prussia respectively, but the Scandinavian monarchy would have known it was foolish to try and stay enemies with two massive powers right along their border, so they would have had to make a decision. From my research, I see Scandinavia making an alliance with Germany in the years before First World War, because in our timeline, Germany asked Sweden for assistance, and Sweden said they would stay neutral, but their neutrality would be benevolent to the German nation. Also, with thought of regaining land lost in the Great Northern War, it's likely that Scandinavia would have aligned itself with the Central Powers. Cue World War I. Everything goes the same as it does in our timeline. Franz Ferdinand gets shot, Austria declares war on Serbia, and the whole chain of dominoes begin to fall down, leading to Europe being engulfed in war. The difference? Scandinavia is now able to provide a second front against the Russians. What this ends up doing is making the fighting more difficult for the Russians on the German front. Though the Scandinavian army was inferior in numbers to the Russian army, they would have diverted enough resources and people so that, even if they began to lose ground, Germany would have made a much easier target out of Russia, weakening them much earlier than they did in our timeline. Russia still experiences their civil war and pulls out of World War I, signing peace with the Central Powers. This time, however, Scandinavia is given the land they lost in the Great Northern War, and possibly seizing some more icy land, just to add to their collection. Now, attention is able to be turned to the theater in France, where Scandinavia sends troops to aid the German front. They cross over into Denmark and join their German allies in the trenches, pushing hard against the British and French. Of course, we couldn't talk about World War without discussing the United States. However, the difference in this timeline is I don't see the United States getting involved as early as they did, and here's why I think that. With Scandinavia on the side of the Germans, it doesn't seem reasonable for them to have sent the infamous Zimmermann Note to Mexico, which was a major catalyst to the United States involvement. In addition to this, there were now two large groups of ethnicities in America that were in the Central Powers, Germans and Scandinavians. If the US joined in the war, which I do see happening eventually since they had been trading with the Allied powers, it would have been later than they did in our timeline, because the public support would have been far lower. So America is far less significant in this World War I. And what this does is allow Germany to press into France, farther and farther until they reach a point where France had been successfully demoralized to where, even if America did enter, many French would simply want out of this war. The two sides would sit at the peace talks, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy heading the Allied side of the deals, and Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans, and Scandinavia on the other side, heading the Central Powers side of the deals. Reparations would be forced out of France, just like what happened to Germany in our timeline, and they would be humiliated on the international stage, and after having just lost 2 wars to the Prussian army, the French Republic would likely fracture, being seen as weak and incompetent by their people. The Ottomans would have survived a smidgen longer, before exploding into a mess of different nations. Russia would still see their civil war raging, but with support from the victorious Central Powers and possibly the Allies, the White Army would have put down the Bolsheviks, securing a non-Soviet Russia. Because if there's one thing that unites enemies, it's communists. Finally, Germany would now be a main player in European and international politics. They would have been given large swaths of African territory and the respect, or fear, of the international world. I won't get into too much detail because we don't care about those countries. Sorry guys. What we want to know is, what about Scandinavia? What does a successful war mean for them? There are major implications to winning such a major war. One of them obviously being regaining lost land, but the other is more symbolic and arguably more important. Scandinavia, after having fought in the First World War as one nation, and being successful, would see this as the correct path for the Nordic countries. Thoughts of them being separate would dwindle, since what was once 3 nations had become one nation, with an identity of Scandinavian, not Danish, Swedish, or Norwegian. Their culture would still not be as homogeneous as that of Germany or Italy, but closer to that of the United Kingdom in its earlier days, where separate nations with separate identities created one overlapping, meshing identity. Through this Scandinavian lens, we would see a European power, growing and strengthening into a modern major player in international politics, comparable to France of our timeline. Not the most powerful or even most influential nation in the world, but someone to be looked at with respect. While there are many ways that a unified Scandinavia could have gone in an alternate timeline, this is what I do believe it would have looked like, though nothing is certain. Leave a comment down below what you think a unified Scandinavia would have looked like, and if you enjoyed my first alternate history video, hit the like button. Subscribe to stay updated on my future content, and leave a suggestion down below for future videos. Thank you for watching. This has been Historical Hindsight, and I'll be seeing you soon.